the tension there, on the one hand, of the prudence and the wisdom that you could make a case for protection and for self-defense as the last resort to a violence. And then this ideal that says, no, there's a reorienting of changing your neighbor when you respond in this way. I think what you see in the tension between that is actually a perspective of eschatology.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that is a perspective or a conviction of how much of God's kingdom is actually here right now.
Right.
So I think there's clear examples in our world that we are not in the perfected new heavens and new earth yet.
Yeah, I hope not.
Right? Right.
It would suck.
So in New Testament, there's this idea called the already not yet, which means that there's a tension between God's power infiltrating and creating a new society from the inside out, which is the church, that is transforming the world, but it's also not yet.
Right.
And so to live in that tension, I think, is to acknowledge that there's merit to both of these.
Yeah.
And so you could have people who love Jesus, who love their neighbor, and are going to come to different conclusions on this. One's going to say, I take it upon myself to respond for the sake of protection and for the sake of love of my neighbor.
Yeah.
To respond with a proportional threat.
Yeah, naturally.
And I think there's going to be people out there who are going to say, no, I'm going to die by this principle. And so there's consequences and costs on both sides.
Yeah.
Right? I personally think that the pacifist perspective is an over-realized eschatology perspective. Meaning, I think that from that perspective, you're understanding too much of the kingdom being here already, where there's too many not ideals that wouldn't facilitate that kind of living. I also will say, from a lot of people I've talked to, or just from random Facebook posts or whatever, that there's an under-realized perspective on the other side, right? Where it's like, no, we need to be the agents of this change. We need to ones who are wielding this about.
Yeah.
And so...
because it's through us that the kingdom becomes realized.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So you could put too much weight on that foot.
Sure.
As well. And so... without making this arbitrary and without saying, well, just pick a perspective on eschatology, I think that there are real challenges out here. And there's an example that is really interesting to me from the Cold War, right? So maybe like 40, 35 years ago, from a Catholic scholar.
Yeah.
And, I really appreciate the ecumenical kind of inclination, right? The more diversity of traditions we can bring in, the better. So tell me a little bit about this Catholic scholar.
So Father John Deere writes this article for the National Catholic Reporter about the specific verse that we quoted earlier from Luke's Gospel,
Luke 22.
Right? And he talks about how it's often misread as a justification for war and violence. And he goes on to explain how he thinks it ought to be interpreted, right? Okay. So the background or the contextual side is this. So shortly before his crucifixion, right, this is where that verse occurs. Jesus is praying in Gethsemane in the garden, and he tells his disciples that, hey, one who doesn't have a sword should sell his cloak and go buy one. So in response to this, the disciples go and find 2 swords, right? And Jesus says, no, okay, that's enough, relax, right? And so as Father Deere explains, the disciples simply didn't understand that Jesus was not speaking literally. He says that when his followers run off to produce 2 swords, Jesus, barely kind of keeping the glimmer of light alive, snaps and actually says, stop, it's enough. Or a better translation, he says, is forget it. You're not getting it. And so the misunderstanding is complete. The scriptures foretell it, and Jesus resigns himself to it, right? It's part and parcel for the vocation that Jesus is going to walk through, essentially.
Right.
And so, but more importantly, the gospel doesn't end there, and Jesus is going to continue pressing the matter, because when the crowd comes to arrest Jesus and Peter strikes the high priest's servant and takes off his ear, Jesus says, no, stop, right? There's an actual act of violence that has occurred in Jesus' presence, and he has gone out of his way to condemn it there, and he actually goes and heals the man's ear.
Correct.
And so
that should inform that
I mean, Jesus is nonviolent, right?
Yeah.
The idea, and Jesus actually asks, what's with all the pitchforks and torches? I was in the temple teaching all the time, and you guys never came for me then. What's different now? And so if we take this, what I like about what Father Deere writes at kind of at the end of his article, he says, if we take this passage absolutely literally to justify war, then clearly the passage limits the entire world to only 2 swords, and we have to share them, right? And I think that's a really good way to look at this conversation is... there's probably some type of theology of accommodation that has to come through this, right? Because we are in this now not yet paradigm that you described earlier, we have to have a discussion about the unavoidable reality that is violence to some degree. And when Paul talks about in Colossians 3 about putting love above all other things, the question is, to whom does my love and loyalty belong first, right? Or more, right? Like my daughter or the neighbor who's potentially trying to do me harm, you know? And, dude, it's a hard rock.
Right.
It's a rock in a hard place, right?
Correct. Because when you talk about things like gun violence, when you talk about things like school shootings, when you talk about things even like the way that firearms are used even in the like judicial system or police system, right? Like you're going to have a case that could be made on both sides.
Sure.
And so I think ultimately what we could say is ideally the Christian way of living or the Christian kingdom living is such that the disarmament, right, is actually not with a reciprocal response.
Right. And we would also say that the violence is the outworking of a brokenness that people have, right, in systems, in experiences, in families. And so our job as Christians isn't to just limit the scope of the conversation to whether or not our reaction to violence should be violence or nonviolence. Our response should actually be, how can we swim upstream and stop these problems from even beginning, right? And so that's probably the best way to live in today's world, as opposed to just like picking a side on this. It should probably be closer to like, how do we stop the problems that contribute to and cause the violence to occur in the first place?
That's great. So I would encourage both of those perspectives to actually reorient or continue to then think deeper about that position and say, well, how do we then from the inside out continue to influence those infrastructures?
Right. Yeah. Because it's a lot easier to live a subversive lifestyle when you don't have to do it in the moment of life and death situations.
Correct.